Assalamualaikum students. So today we are going to discuss about the little bit detail in a short video about the blood vascular system. So basically, what is blood vascular system? Blood vascular system comprises the basically blood vessels which carry the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, and it comprises of the three parts as we know very well: the arteries, the veins, and the capillaries. And arteries transport blood from the heart and distribute it to the various tissues of the body by means of their branches, and they refer to as arterioles. The joining of the branches of the arteries is anastomosis. This was a very important terminology we used in the medical terms and in the hospitals, and just describing our anatomy of the blood vascular system. So this is anastomosis. While anatomical end arteries, functional end arteries, we were discussing it that, and veins are basically vessels that transport the blood back to the heart. Many of them possesses valves. The smallest veins are called the venules. This was very important. The smallest veins are basically called the venules. The smaller veins or the tributaries unite to form larger veins, which commonly join with those of another to form the venous plexus. So this was basically the whole scenario about the blood vascular system. So one by one, if we just label that diagram so we can acknowledge it properly. As we know, the largest artery of our body is basically the aorta. So this was arc of aorta. This was arc of aorta. It is the part in which basic blood was collected, and just from this system it got passed to the lungs, and this was the basically parts which were showing in the diagram. This was the lung part, how the blood vasculatory system would goes around and spread in that system. This was the liver system, and this was the small intestine, how they carry the minute system. This was basically the general plan for the blood vascular system. So this was most probably the right common. This was the right common carotid artery. This was basically carotid artery, while this was basically the internal jugular vein. This was jugular vein. As the name indicates, or the blue and red color. The red color is always for the oxygenated blood, while the blue color is always for the deoxygenated blood. So always remember, when the veins goes into the subclavicle part, they were called the subclavian vessels. They were basically the right subclavian vessels. These are the subclavian vessels. This was the right. There was also the right. There was all the proportions are basically they are right. While that the red portion indicated are there, this was basically related to the pulmonary circulation. This was basically the pulmonary circulation. This was basically pulmonary circulation. And that part which is comprises internal, this was called the cavity of right atrium. This was cavity right atrium. This was basically the cavity of right atrium, and this was the ventricle. This was the above is the atrium, and the downward is basically the ventricle. This was the right ventricle, right. And the same as above, this was the left cavity LC, and this was the LV, which is left ventricle. So these are the portion who just they have a specific valves which control the blood flow which is coming from the body and towards the lungs. So this was the basic mechanism. Though this was basically the hepatic vein, because it just goes into the liver. This was called the hepatic vein. This was hepatic vein, and this was, as I said, this was the liver, and this was the vein coming outside that is basically the portal vein. This was the portal vein. So if it is a portal vein, as we know, the blood supplies which are providing into the intestine, this was basically called the intestinal vessels. Intestinal vessels. Always remember the vessels which were coming towards the iliac part, they were called the iliac vessels. Iliac vessels. They were also called the common iliac vessels. And this was called inferior mesenteric artery. This was basically the inferior, because this was below, because it supplies towards the lower part, inferior mesenteric artery. Inferior mesenteric artery. And this was the celiac artery. The kind of the gut supplies all comprises on that. This was the celiac artery. Celiac artery. And this was, if the aorta was there, it was just simply called the aorta, otherwise there it is called the abdominal aorta. Abdominal aorta. It is called the abdominal aorta there. And that part which just comprises below the heart, this was called the inferior vena cava. This upper part was called the superior vena cava, and this was called the inferior vena cava. And as you know, this part is basically called the pulmonary trunk. This was called the pulmonary trunk. I just like visualize that part into this pulmonary trunk. This was an important part because it carries the major part towards your over system and all that. This was the basically major trunk part which comprises the much of the blood in that. So this was the basically journal plan for the blood vascular system, and it was also there some sort of arteriovenous anesmatosis. The site of such connections are basically referred to as arteriovenous anastomosis. And always remember there is a sinusoids which were resemble to the capillaries, and they are very thin walled blood vessels, but they have an irregular cross diameter and wider than capillaries. So this was a journal assumption. This was the journal intro about the blood vascular system. I hope you like it. So enjoy your learning with the basic concepts. Thank you.